Okay, so revolution did not happen overnight. It takes some time. It takes everybody kind of getting on the same page. And there's two sides to this. One, we tend to look at history from an American perspective, and we look at all the ways that King George was a tyrant and a horrible human being by the things he did to the colonists. But from his perspective, if the colonists had stayed where he told them to stay and had quit messing around with the Ohio Valley region and with the French, then the French and Indian War would not have happened. So he felt that the colonists did bear some responsibility in paying that debt. In particularly being taxed. The colonists, though, on the other hand, look at this and say, hey, we don't have representation over there. We are a part of this broader scope of an empire. And we should have. And George is saying, well, but you have representation here. It's really based off of misunderstandings. And you can kind of see where both parties feel that the other one has some responsibilities. But, the biggest point of this is King George does enact taxes on the colonists that he does not necessarily enact in England. And ironically, some of these taxes have already been there. They just haven't been enforced. So let's look at the ways that King George felt that the colonists should pay for this war. Beginning with Grenville Sugar Act. So Grenville was a prime minister from 1763 to 1765, very short-lived as prime minister, and he initiated the Sugar and Stamp Acts. So the Sugar Act of 1764 was based off of the Sugar and Molasses Act of 1733, which was about to expire. So this had already been in effect. It was something that was just changed a little differently. So what this original act was, the 1733 Act, was for every gallon of molasses that was imported, they were supposed to be taxed 6 pence. Okay, guys, what do you use molasses to make? For those of you who don't know, you use molasses to make rum. Rum was one of there were lots and lots and lots of rum distilleries in colonial America. So they would get their molasses, usually from the Caribbean somewhere, imported in. They were supposed to be taxed. It was a very corrupt system. Usually the molasses came in, there was an element of bribery, there was an element of smuggling. The taxation was not ever paid on the molasses that came in to colonial America. The new act actually reduced the tax on molasses from 6 pence to 3 pence. Cut it in half. But what he did do was he raised the penalties for smuggling. So, with doing this, all British crews could act as customs officers. They could board any suspicious ship and seize cargo without any warning, and smugglers were persecuted, and they would be sent to Nova Scotia to be persecuted. And this caused an immediate decline of the rum industry. So we're talking there were 140 rum distilleries in the colonies. They produced an estimated 4.8 million gallons of rum per year. And the strict enforcement on this tax meant that it cost the colonists to produce rum. In turn, costing those colonists who bought the rum, it cost them more money. So even though the taxes were lowered, it did hurt the industry because it was enforced. Grenville insisted on a rigorous attention to paperwork and strict accounting, and it did include other goods, not just molasses. It included coffee, sugar, calico, lumber, iron. And it really reduced the market that the colonies could sell to, also reduced the amount of British goods they could receive. To the British, the act seemed very fair, but to the colonists, it was an intrusion. 1765, we see the Stamp Act go into effect, and it's a tax on all paper used for official business. So especially things like court documents, licenses, wills, ship cargo list. So you're getting molasses. Now you have to pay your 3 pence. Now every sheet of paper that has that cargo on it, because it is official business, is taxed now. And this obviously seems a little out there. The Stamp Act was proof that that the tax, or the stamp that went on that piece of paper was proof that the tax had been paid. And this was just simply a step to raise money, primarily to pay for British troops who remained in the colonies. The money collected actually did remain in the colonies. It didn't go back to England. It remained in the colonies. But the American colonists felt that the act was unconstitutional because they had not elected representation to Parliament to be able to vote on this act. They felt that they were enslaved by their own government. So this really comes to heads with this concept of virtual representation. The colonists argued that the king could not force his subjects to give money, only that the House of Commons could grant money. Grenville argued that the colonists did have representation in Parliament because all British subjects were represented no matter where they were. Colonial leaders, in turn, rejected that view by arguing that virtual representation could not stretch across the Atlantic Ocean. So the Stamp Act further illustrated a growing problem in the colonies. So you see groups who really resist this, like the Sons of Liberty, and these men were not the leading men that are portrayed in this miniseries, The Sons of Liberty, if you've watched it. It's too risky for them to be involved with a violent group. I apologize if you can hear my dog barking in the background. We just had company show up, so I'm gonna wrap this up. It was too risky for them to be involved with a violent group, and there's entirely too much public exposure for them to be involved in something like this. So we're looking at people like Benjamin Eads, and it's Edes, who was a printer. John Gill, who had the Boston Gazette. It was composed of workers and tradesmen. Began with about 9 men, swelled up to close to 2,000. And it was organized under a man by the name of Ebenezer Mackintosh, and he was a shoemaker. August 14th, 1765, they took an effigy of Andrew Oliver, who was the distributor of stamps in Boston. And what an effigy is basically a likeness of someone. And they burnt, anyways, this effigy was found hanging in a tree. By evening, a mob formed and burnt Oliver's house, his property. They beheaded the effigy, stoned his house. Then they burnt the remaining pieces of the effigy. And no one dared to respond to this violence. By the end of the year, the Sons were in every colony, and their primary purpose was to force stamp collectors to resign. Their most effective work was done in newsprint, primarily because newspapers were hit the hardest with the Stamp Act. Some printed daily, maybe even twice per day. Propaganda was published. Often they delivered the papers without the official stamp. By 1767, we see the Townshend duties. This is a new tax. It was named after Charles Townshend, who produced them. And he established new taxes on tea, glass, lead, paper, and painter's colors that were imported into the colonies. The importer paid the tax, but then turned around and charged the customer for the taxes that he had to pay. So you can see that just even the average colonist who's not a business owner or anything, they're paying those taxes, and so prices are really increasing on things. Another group who forms are the Daughters of Liberty, and these are women who displayed their loyalties to their colonies by boycotting English imported goods. They refused to drink British tea. They used their skills to weave yarn and wool into cloth. They made America much less dependent on England for textiles. They refused to even receive gentlemen callers who were not sympathetic to the cause. One of the most notorious Daughters of Liberty was Abigail Adams. For those of you who don't know, little bonus point, there is a Daughters of Liberty group organization in Kentucky that if you can show that one of your ancestors has was involved in the Revolutionary War, there's potential scholarship money and stuff out there for you. Just something to keep in mind. Go talk to your school counselor about that if you haven't already, if you can prove that. So all this, it's a lot of massive protesting. It's a lot of organized protesting. It's a lot of hostility, and it leads to things like the Boston Massacre, which happens in March of 1770. 5 colonists were killed, so we call it the Boston Massacre. 5 colonists were killed. I don't mean to like downplay what happened, but I mean it's not this amount of massacre that we tend to think about the Boston Massacre being. 5 colonists were killed. Was basically kind of a street fight that broke out between a patriot mob throwing stuff at British soldiers. And I'm not just talking like throwing paper wads, guys. I'm talking they're throwing snowballs, stones, sticks. Interestingly, a town meeting was called and demanded the removal of the British and the trial of Captain Preston and his men for the murder. Ironically, at the trial, John Adams actually and Josiah Quincy II defended the British, leading to their acquittal and their release. And one of the reasons that Adams does this is he felt that it would show that they were still British and still wanted to be treated as such. Samuel Quincy and Robert Treat Paine were the attorneys for the prosecution. Later, 2 of the British soldiers were found guilty of manslaughter. However, this was definitely another step toward rebellion. And then we've got the Boston Tea Party of 1733. Now, I'm not going to go into many details here because this is one of those things you've probably heard the entire time you've been in school. It was in part caused because the British were trying to save the failing East India Company, basically forced the colonists to have this tea. They taxed the colonies on the tea coming into the harbor because, well, they were British and they liked tea also. And really think about that. The colonists, they're British. They're gonna drink tea. But because it was being forced on them, whether they wanted the tea or not, and remember the Daughters of Liberty, they are boycotting any imported English goods. The Sons of Liberty dumped the tea in the harbor because not importing it was not an option. They dumped 342 crates of tea. That's about $1 million worth of tea today into the harbor. In response, we have the Coercive Acts, also called the Intolerable Acts. This is really Lord North's brainchild. It's meant to punish the Massachusetts for destroying the tea. It's got several parts to it. The Boston Port Act. The Boston Port was closed until all damages were paid. The Massachusetts Government Act restricted Massachusetts town meetings and appointed members to the Governor's Council. Impartial Administration of Justice Act. British officers immune to criminal prosecution. I mean, this is really getting kind of crazy. The Quartering Act required colonists to quarter British troops on demand and give up their homes. I mean, they had to let them in their homes. And the Quebec Act gave disputed land in the Ohio Valley to Quebec. Okay, are you hearing that? This is no longer the Ohio Valley. They're not letting the colonists, the American colonists, have it. They gave it to Quebec. So this is a pretty big deal. So whenever we come back, we're going to look at the First Continental Congress, and we should have about one more video, and as far as lectures go, and then you'll just have your work for the week. So maybe 2 more. I am not real sure yet. So, but that's where we're at. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me.